There are relationships in Hollywood that exist purely on paper. Contracts, call sheets, shared scenes in front of camera. And then there are the other kind, the ones that nobody planned, the ones that form quietly between takes in green rooms and parking lots and late-night phone calls that never made it into any tabloid. The kind that last not for a season or a run of episodes, but for an entire lifetime. What Christina Applegate revealed about Ed O'Neill after their recent reunion is one of those stories. And the reason it hits so hard is simple. Nobody saw it coming. Not even Christina. When Married with Children premiered in April of 1987, the television landscape had never seen anything quite like it. It was loud, it was crude, it was deliberately offensive in ways that made network executives nervous every single week. Fox was a brand new channel at the time, desperate for something that would make people pay attention, and the Bundy family delivered that, and then some. But what the audience saw on screen, the chaos, the insults, the relentless dysfunction, was built on something underneath it that was the complete opposite. Something steady, something protective, something that had nothing to do with the script. Christina Applegate was 15 years old when she walked onto that set for the first time. 15. She was a child, technically speaking, being handed a role that required her to play a teenage sex symbol in a show that was already courting controversy before a single episode had aired. The jokes written for her character were suggestive. The wardrobe was designed to draw attention. And the entertainment media of the late 1980s was not exactly known for treating young women with particular care or nuance. Ed O'Neill was in his early 40s. He had lived enough of life to understand exactly what kind of environment a 15-year-old girl had just stepped into. And without being asked, without any conversation about it, without it appearing anywhere in his contract, he made a decision. He was going to look out for her. What that actually looked like in practice is the part that people are only now beginning to understand. It was not dramatic. There were no big confrontations or public declarations. It was quieter than that and more consistent. He would position himself near her during filming sessions that felt charged. He would redirect conversations when they drifted somewhere that was not appropriate for someone her age. When visitors to the set started paying the kind of attention that made the hair stand up on the back of your neck, Ed was already moving before anyone else had registered what was happening. He had a gift for it. The gentle course correction, the subtle shift in the room's energy that nobody could point to, but everyone felt. Crew members who spent years on that production have described watching this dynamic unfold in real time. They would see him pull her aside between takes and check on her. Not about the scene, about her, about how she was doing, whether she was tired, whether something was bothering her, whether she needed anything. It was the kind of attention that a good parent pays to a child, and it never stopped regardless of how the day was going or how much pressure everyone was under to finish shooting. He also did something that speaks to a certain rare kind of character. He stayed in contact with her mother. He would call. He would give updates. He would reassure her that Christina was being looked after on a set that could have easily become an environment no parent would feel comfortable sending their teenage daughter into. That regular contact was not part of his job. It was not something anyone asked him to do. It was simply what a decent person does when a child has been placed in their orbit. Christina has said in various interviews over the years that she did not fully comprehend what Ed was doing for her while it was happening. That is the nature of that kind of protection. You only understand it looking backward. You only see the shape of it once you are old enough to recognize what it was shielding you from. She has described arriving on set as a teenager who was excited and grateful and fundamentally unaware of how many ways things could have gone wrong. And she has described leaving 11 years later as an adult who had been shaped in ways she is still discovering by the consistent presence of someone who cared whether she was okay. The show itself was a battleground almost from day one. There was always someone who wanted it canceled, always a pressure group or a sponsor pulling back, always a news cycle that treated Married with Children as a symbol of everything wrong with American culture. The cast learned early to wear that controversy lightly. But in 1989, the opposition took on a shape that felt genuinely threatening. A woman in Michigan, deeply offended by a particular episode, launched what became one of the most organized advertiser boycott campaigns in television history up to that point. She contacted major corporations directly. She appeared on national programs. She framed the show as a danger to American family values, and she was persuasive enough that major sponsors started pulling out one by one. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, company after company distanced themselves from the Bundys. Fox executives, still finding their footing as a network, were rattled. The internal conversations about cancellation were serious ones. For a 17-year-old whose entire professional life existed within that show, this was not an abstract business problem. This was terrifying. Christina has talked about the particular kind of fear that comes from watching something you built start to fall apart before you are old enough to know how to handle it. The helplessness of it. The way the ground shifts under you when you realize that forces far larger than you have decided to take aim at the thing you love. Ed O'Neill refused to let that fear set the tone. He gathered the younger cast members, Christina and David Faustino, who played her brother Bud, and he told them something they needed to hear. He said that regardless of what the network decided, regardless of what happened with advertisers or ratings or public opinion, they had made something worth making. He said that their work had value independent of whether anyone chose to fund it going forward. It was the kind of thing that sounds simple but hits differently when you're 17 and scared and the person saying it has actually lived enough life to mean it. He also went to the press, not to vent or to fight, but to defend. He gave interviews that placed the younger members of the cast in a specific light, not as provocateurs, not as willing participants in something harmful, but as young people doing their jobs with commitment and integrity. He refused to let them become collateral damage in someone else's culture war. He put his own reputation on the line to protect theirs. The boycott backfired in ways nobody predicted. The controversy drew in viewers who had never watched the show, and many of them liked what they found. Ratings climbed. The show that was supposed to be shamed into cancellation came out of the experience more popular than it had entered it. It became one of the more remarkable turns in television history. Christina has said that what she remembers most from that period is not the ratings victory. It is not the vindication. What she remembers is Ed standing beside her when the outcome was genuinely uncertain. She remembers watching someone model what it looks like to hold steady when everything is shaking. That lesson stayed with her longer than any scene they filmed together. The show ran for 11 seasons, which is an almost unreasonable length of time for any television production. And when it ended in 1997, it ended without ceremony. There was no finale that the writers knew would be a finale. There was no final episode designed to give the characters and the audience a proper goodbye. One week they were making television. The next week the show was over and everyone was supposed to go on with their lives. 11 years of shared mornings. 11 years of knowing exactly where to be, who would be there, what the day would look like. 11 years of a family, even a fictional one, providing the structure and rhythm of daily existence. And then nothing. Christina has described that aftermath as something that takes years to process. You go from being surrounded by people who know you completely to a silence that has no shape to it. The set where you spent your entire adolescence and early adulthood gets dismantled. The place that contained all of it simply ceases to exist. And you're left trying to figure out who you are outside the context of something that had defined you for more than a decade. What she has made clear is that the transition was made bearable by the fact that the relationships did not actually end. Ed stayed in contact, not occasionally, regularly. There were phone calls and meals and the steady, quiet maintenance of a connection that had nothing to prove to anyone and did not require a camera or a call sheet to justify itself. He watched her career from a position of genuine investment. When she succeeded, his pride was real. When things were difficult, he was reachable. She went on to build a substantial body of work after married with children. Films, other television series, award recognition, a reputation as someone who could be trusted to deliver. Ed had his own extraordinary second chapter. Modern Family ran for 11 seasons and introduced him to an entirely new generation of viewers who had no frame of reference for Al Bundy. By any measure, both of them thrived. And through all of it, the connection between them persisted. It did not require effort in the way that many maintained relationships do. It simply continued because the foundation of it was something real. Then, in August of 2021, Christina posted something that changed the conversation entirely. She announced that she had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The disease had been discovered while she was still filming the final season of Dead to Me on Netflix. She had kept it private through those months of production, completing the work she had committed to while processing a diagnosis that had rewritten everything she thought she knew about her future. When she made it public, the response was immediate and overwhelming. But what happened privately, in the hours and days that followed, is the part that matters most to this story. Ed called, not a text, not a social media post. He called, and he said what needed to be said, and he made certain she understood that his presence in her life was not conditional on her being well or successful or easy to be around. The protector who had positioned himself near a 15-year-old girl on a television set 4 decades earlier was still positioned the same way. Some roles, it turns out, are not performances. They are simply who you are. Multiple sclerosis is a disease that rewrites a person's relationship with their own body. It affects the nervous system in ways that are unpredictable and progressive. Christina has been open about the specific ways it has changed her daily reality. She uses a cane now. There are days when the cognitive fog makes concentration difficult. There is chronic pain. There is the particular grief that comes from being fully present in a life while simultaneously mourning the version of that life you expected to have. She has talked about this grief with a directness that most people find difficult to achieve, the willingness to name the loss without softening it, while still remaining present in the moment. The entire cast of Married with Children rallied around her. Katie Sagal, who played her mother on screen and had become something genuinely maternal off it, made her support loud and clear. David Faustino showed up the way a brother shows up. Amanda Burse reached out. The family they had built on a soundstage in the late 1980s revealed itself, once again, to be something sturdier than most people had assumed fictional families could become. But it was Ed's response that landed differently. Christina has been clear about this, not because the others cared less, but because of what he represented. The first person who had ever looked out for her in this industry, still looking out for her 40 years on. In November of 2022, Christina made her first major public appearance since the diagnosis. She was receiving a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, which under any circumstances would be a significant event, and under these specific circumstances required a level of courage that is difficult to overstate. She walked to that ceremony with a cane. Her movements were slower. The disease had left its marks in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. She chose not to hide any of it. The crowd that gathered was enormous, and the people who stood alongside her were not just there as names on a guest list. They were there because she matters to them, and because showing up was the only appropriate response to watching someone refuse to disappear. Her speech that afternoon was not a performance of strength. It was something rarer than that, an honest account of what she had been through, delivered by someone who had decided that honesty was the only thing worth offering. 2 months later came the moment that most people who saw it have not forgotten. She appeared at the Emmy Awards in January of 2023. She walked onto the stage at the Peacock Theater in Los Angeles, cane in hand, and the audience did something that was not planned and could not have been choreographed. They stood up. Every person in that room rose to their feet simultaneously, and they stayed there, and the sound of what they were feeling filled the theater in a way that the television broadcast could only partially capture. It went on, nearly a full minute, in a room full of people who have seen everything, who are professionally difficult to surprise, who are in general not given to spontaneous displays of genuine emotion. Christina Applegate walked out and produced exactly that. She stood there in the middle of it, visibly moved, visibly trying to hold herself together. And then, because she is who she is, she made a joke about the crowd shaking her brain. The room laughed and cried at the same time. It was precisely the response the moment called for, and she found it instinctively, the way someone finds the right word in a language they have spoken their whole life. What most people watching at home did not know was what unfolded that evening beyond the broadcast. The private conversations, the people who sought her out, the words exchanged between people who had shared something real and were now standing on the other side of a health crisis that had tested what that something real was actually made of. Ed was part of those conversations. The specifics belonged to them, but their nature was the same as it had always been. Him making sure she was okay, her knowing that he was there. When the news broke about their reunion and what Christina had chosen to share publicly in its aftermath, the response was immediate and deeply felt, because the story she told was not the story people had been expecting. There was no revelation of conflict, no grievance aired after decades of silence. What she exposed, when given the opportunity to expose anything, was this: that Ed O'Neill had been a genuinely good person to her from the first day they met, and that he had never stopped. In an industry and a cultural moment that has trained all of us to anticipate the worst version of these stories, the hidden abuse, the betrayal, the relationship that looked one way on screen and another way entirely behind it, Christina Applegate stood up and said that what she had experienced was the opposite of that. She had been protected. She had been mentored. She had been loved with consistency and without condition by someone who had no obligation to offer any of it. That is the story. That is what she exposed. She has started a podcast with Jamie Lynn Sigler, who also lives with MS, called Messy. It has given her a way to stay connected to an audience that clearly still wants to hear from her, in a format that accommodates what her life actually looks like now rather than what it used to look like. She can participate on her own terms, which is the only kind of participation worth having. A reunion of the married with children cast remains a possibility that no one has closed the door on. Ed has made his position clear. He is not interested in revisiting the Bundys without Christina. The other cast members have said the same. Whatever form any kind of reunion might take, it would need to be built around what she can do and what she is comfortable with, not the other way around. The cast that spent 11 years being a family on screen has collectively decided that their loyalty to each other runs deeper than any commercial consideration. Whatever gets made, if anything gets made, happens with all of them or with none of them. What Christina and Ed's story ultimately reveals is something about what loyalty actually looks like when it is genuine rather than performed. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It shows up without being asked and stays without being thanked and requires no audience to justify its continued existence. It is Ed positioning himself next to a 15-year-old girl on a television set, because the environment she was in required someone to do that. It is him calling her mother so that a parent could sleep at night. It is him standing in front of reporters to protect his younger castmates from becoming symbols in someone else's argument. It is him calling in August of 2021 when a text would have been easier and less was expected of him. And it is Christina, for decades on, standing in front of the world and saying plainly that this is what happened. That the story behind the story, the one the cameras never caught, was a story about care. She walked onto that set as a teenager who needed someone to look out for her. She found that person immediately, and he has been looking out for her ever since. She is not the same person she was in 1987. The illness has changed her. The years have changed her. Life, as it always does, has left its marks in ways both visible and invisible. But some things have not changed. The bond is still there. Ed is still watching. And Christina Applegate, against every expectation and through every difficulty, is still here, still working, still connecting, still making people feel less alone in their own struggles by refusing to pretend that hers do not exist. That is what she exposed after the reunion. Not a scandal, not a secret that damages anyone. Something far more valuable and far more rare. A friendship that turned out to be the real thing. A relationship that survived time and distance and illness and everything else that life throws at people when they are not looking. Some things, it turns out, are simply unbreakable, and now the whole world knows it.